December 7, 1941. 7:48 a.m. local time. Pearl Harbor, territory of Hawaii. The first bomb struck Battleship Row before most of the Pacific Fleet had completed morning colors. Within minutes, fuel oil burned across the harbor's surface. Radio traffic spiked, then collapsed under its own volume. Pilots scrambled without orders. Ammunition lockers were still locked. What mattered most and was noticed only later was what was not there. The American aircraft carriers were at sea. At the time, this absence did not feel decisive. It felt accidental. A scheduling irregularity. A logistical coincidence. No one at Pearl Harbor believed that morning they were witnessing the opening of a war that would be decided not by fleets or armies, but by industrial throughput measured in months and shipping tonnage measured in oceans. The United States entered the war under a false assumption shared by nearly every major power, that modern war would be decided by early operational blows, not by sustained production under constraint. This assumption was rational. It had been correct in 1918. It had shaped every interwar military doctrine. And it would quietly collapse under the weight of time. Washington, D.C., December 8, 1941. Congress declared war with near unanimity. The decision was immediate. The implications were not. The United States was not mobilized for total war. It had an army ranked 19th in the world by size. Its industrial base was enormous but misaligned, built for consumer goods, not armored vehicles. Its shipping capacity was insufficient for a two-ocean war. Its trained manpower pipeline was measured in months, not weeks. The country did not lack resources. It lacked time. Franklin D. Roosevelt understood this constraint more clearly than most of his generals. He had already made one irreversible commitment months earlier, quietly before the first bombs fell on Hawaii. Germany first. This decision was not driven by emotion or alliance loyalty. It was driven by arithmetic. Germany controlled the industrial core of Europe. If the Soviet Union collapsed, German production would spike beyond anything Britain could contain. If Britain fell, American mobilization would face an Atlantic sealed by hostile ports and airfields. Japan was dangerous. Germany was terminal. But prioritization carried its own cost. Resources sent to Britain could not be sent to the Pacific. Escorts assigned to Atlantic convoys could not protect shipping to Australia. Every ship committed early narrowed flexibility later. The decision made sense. It also locked the United States into a long war before it was ready for one. The first months after Pearl Harbor were defined by delay. American factories could not immediately produce tanks, aircraft, or artillery at scale. What they could produce, trucks, radios, machine tools, were not decisive on their own. The conversion of civilian industry required retooling cycles measured in quarters. Labor had to be trained. Supply chains had to be rebuilt. Steel allocation became a zero-sum game. In January 1942, the United States produced fewer than 100 combat aircraft per week. Germany was producing nearly 5 times that number. Japan, despite limited resources, was operating at full wartime output with factories already optimized for military production. The United States had committed to a war whose decisive phase would occur before its advantages fully materialized. This was not visible on maps. It was visible in spreadsheets. In the Pacific, the consequences arrived first. Japanese forces advanced across Southeast Asia with operational precision. The Philippines fell. Singapore surrendered. The Dutch East Indies collapsed. Oil fields changed hands faster than American shipping could respond. Each Japanese advance shortened supply lines for Tokyo and lengthened them for Washington. Distance was not abstract. San Francisco to Pearl Harbor was 2,400 miles. Pearl Harbor to Manila was another 5,000. Every gallon of fuel burned by an American task force required weeks of shipping support. Every damaged ship required transit time measured in months. Japan had assumed, logically, that this distance would prevent sustained American response. They were not wrong in the short term. The first American counteroffensives were limited not by will, but by hulls. In early 1942, the U.S. Navy did not have enough fleet oilers to support continuous carrier operations. Dry docks on the West Coast were already overbooked. Pearl Harbor could repair battleships, but carriers required specialized facilities thousands of miles away. This forced a pattern of risk concentration. American carriers operated together, not because doctrine demanded it, but because losing one in isolation would reduce operational capacity below recovery thresholds. Every sortie carried disproportionate strategic weight. Japan understood this. It also misunderstood something else. April 18, 1942. The Doolittle Raid. 16 B-25 bombers launched from the USS Hornet, striking Tokyo and other Japanese cities. Militarily, the raid was negligible. The damage was minor. The aircraft were lost. Strategically, it altered Japanese decision-making in a way that could not be reversed. The raid demonstrated that Japan's defensive perimeter was incomplete. More importantly, it suggested that the United States was willing to expend scarce assets for psychological effect. The Japanese response was rational. They expanded their operational objective. Midway. The decision to attack Midway was driven by a desire to force a decisive fleet engagement. Japan needed to destroy American carriers before American production reached critical mass. Time favored the United States, but only if the United States survived intact. This was Japan's narrowing window. June 4, 1942. The Battle of Midway. The outcome hinged not on superior American planning, but on Japanese overextension under informational constraint. Carrier decks crowded with rearming aircraft. Search planes launched late. Command decisions made with partial intelligence. 4 Japanese fleet carriers were lost in one morning. The United States lost one. The balance of naval aviation in the Pacific shifted permanently. At the time, this did not appear decisive. Japan still held territory. Its army was intact. Its production continued. But the loss of trained carrier aircrews was irreversible. Japan could replace ships. It could not replace experience at the same rate. The United States, unknowingly, had crossed the threshold where time began working asymmetrically in its favor. But advantage did not mean speed. From mid-1942 through 1943, the United States fought a war of controlled scarcity. The Guadalcanal campaign consumed shipping, fuel, and lives disproportionate to the territory gained. Airfields changed hands. Supply lines were stretched to their limit. Weather destroyed as much equipment as combat. Every American decision in this period was shaped by what could not be replaced quickly. Aircraft losses mattered less than pilot training capacity. Ship losses mattered less than dry dock availability. Infantry casualties mattered less than the flow of replacements across oceans. This was not yet overwhelming force. It was survival under constraint. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Germany First strategy imposed its own delays. American ground forces were not ready for a cross-channel invasion. British forces were overstretched. Soviet armies were absorbing catastrophic losses. The United States compensated with what it could provide immediately. Material. Lend-Lease shipments crossed the Atlantic and Arctic in increasing volume. Trucks, locomotives, aluminum, food, fuel. These shipments did not win battles directly. They prevented collapse. Shipping losses mounted. German U-boats sank hundreds of thousands of tons monthly in early 1942. Coastal defenses were inadequate. Convoy systems were incomplete. For months, the Atlantic was a killing ground. The United States responded not with brilliance but with mass. Shipyards expanded. Liberty ships were produced faster than U-boats could sink them. Standardization replaced elegance. Welding replaced riveting. Production curves bent upward. By late 1943, American shipbuilding output exceeded global losses. The bottleneck shifted, from hulls to ports, from ports to rail, from rail to frontline units. Pressure migrated but did not disappear. The war's center of gravity was no longer a battlefield. It was a timetable. The United States had committed to a form of warfare that required uninterrupted production, protected shipping, and political cohesion over years. Any disruption, labor unrest, electoral reversal, industrial bottleneck, could delay decisive action. Germany and Japan faced the opposite problem. They needed resolution before American capacity peaked. Every month that passed without decisive victory reduced their available options. This asymmetry was not announced. It emerged. By 1944, the outcome was structurally constrained. American aircraft production exceeded 96,000 units annually. Tank production reached levels Germany could not match even with occupied Europe. Oil flows were uninterrupted. Training pipelines were stable. Yet even then, victory was not guaranteed. Normandy required weather windows, port capture, artificial harbors. The invasion force depended on fuel shipped from across the Atlantic, unloaded under fire, transported inland over roads not built for mechanized armies. Failure would not mean defeat. It would mean delay. Delay was the enemy. The United States did not win World War II through flawless strategy or moral clarity. It won by surviving long enough for its initial constraints to invert. Early decisions, Germany first, carrier preservation, industrial mobilization, were not visionary. They were conservative responses to limited information and real risk. Each choice reduced flexibility. Each commitment postponed resolution. But together they forced the war into a form the United States was uniquely equipped to endure. By the time this became visible, it was already irreversible. June 6, 1944. Shortly after midnight. The English Channel. The invasion fleet did not move as a single force. It moved as a system under tension. Landing craft were delayed by weather that could not be predicted with certainty. Artificial harbors had to survive Atlantic swells they were never designed to endure. Fuel pipelines were still theoretical. Every contingency assumed that at least part of the system would fail. The question was not whether something would go wrong. It was how much delay could be absorbed before the structure collapsed. The United States had built an army capable of landing in France. It had not built one capable of repeating the attempt indefinitely. Shipping schedules, reserve divisions, and production cycles were synchronized to a narrow window. Failure would not end the war. It would extend it beyond the political and logistical tolerance of the coalition. This was the cost of Germany first, paid 3 years later. The Normandy landings succeeded not because resistance collapsed, but because German response time was constrained. German armor was held back by command indecision. Fuel shortages limited movement. Allied air superiority did not destroy the Wehrmacht in a single blow, but it delayed reinforcement at every critical hour. Delay accumulated. By the time German command structures adapted, the beachheads were too large to eliminate without a counteroffensive Germany could no longer supply. This was not collapse. It was saturation. Germany had entered a phase where losses could no longer be compensated by output. The United States had entered the opposite phase. By late summer 1944, American production was no longer merely sufficient. It was excessive. The constraint was no longer factories. It was ports. Antwerp remained closed for months. Supplies piled up in Normandy. Trucks wore out faster than they could be replaced. Fuel shortages slowed advances not because fuel did not exist, but because it could not reach the front. The Red Ball Express ran continuously, consuming tires, engines, and manpower at unsustainable rates. The United States could afford this waste. Germany could not. Every mile advanced westward increased German logistical stress while easing American resupply. The imbalance widened with distance. This was not strategy as brilliance. It was geometry. In December 1944, Germany attempted to reverse the equation. The Ardennes offensive was built on a single narrowing assumption, that surprise and speed could compensate for fuel scarcity. It nearly worked. American lines bent. Units were encircled. Weather-grounded aircraft. Command systems lagged. But the offensive was constrained from the start by fuel math that allowed no deviation. When the advance slowed, there was no margin left. Once American air power returned, German movement ceased. Fuel dumps ran dry. Vehicles were abandoned intact. Trained manpower was expended in an operation that could not be repeated. Germany crossed its final point of no return without recognizing it. The United States absorbed the shock, then resumed forward motion. May 1945. Germany surrendered. For the first time since 1941, the United States could redirect the full weight of its system. The Pacific War entered a new phase. It did not become easier. It became denser. The strategic problem in the Pacific was not defeating Japan's navy. That had already been accomplished. It was reaching the Japanese home islands without exhausting the system. Every island captured shortened bomber range but consumed shipping. Every airfield built required engineers, fuel, and protection. Casualties accumulated slowly but predictably. Japanese resistance intensified as options disappeared. Iwo Jima. Okinawa. Each battle demonstrated a pattern that could not be ignored. Japan no longer needed to win. It only needed to delay. By mid-1945, the United States faced a constraint it had postponed confronting. Invasion. Operation Downfall required manpower levels unseen in American history. Casualty projections varied, but all assumed losses measured in hundreds of thousands. Shipping requirements strained even American capacity. Medical systems were already planning for saturation. The industrial system could support the invasion. The political system might not. The war had become a problem of endurance rather than capability. This was not a failure of planning. It was the logical end of a sequence set in motion years earlier. The atomic bomb entered this system not as a moral argument, but as a compression mechanism. It offered resolution without delay. It bypassed invasion logistics, manpower attrition, and the uncertainty of prolonged resistance. It converted industrial superiority directly into strategic finality. Hiroshima, August 6, 1945. Nagasaki, August 9, 1945. Japan surrendered. The war ended not because the United States had exhausted its options, but because it had eliminated the need to choose among them. In retrospect, the outcome appears inevitable. It was not. At multiple points, 1942 in the Atlantic, 1943 in the Pacific, 1944 in Europe, the United States operated close to systemic limits. Had shipping losses persisted longer, had production conversion stalled, had political cohesion fractured, the war's timeline would have stretched into forms less favorable. Victory emerged not from a single decisive act, but from the cumulative effect of decisions made under constraint and sustained long enough for their consequences to mature. The United States won World War II because it forced the conflict into a domain where time, scale, and distance functioned as multipliers rather than liabilities. Once that inversion occurred, defeat became structurally unlikely. By the time this was clear to all participants, no alternative outcomes remained. The war reshaped global power permanently. The United States emerged with industrial capacity intact, a mobilized population and global logistical infrastructure already in place. The institutions built to fight the war became the architecture of post-war order. Germany and Japan were defeated not solely on the battlefield, but within systems they could not outproduce, outlast, or outscale. The Cold War inherited these structures. So did American power. The decisions that won the war also defined the world that followed. If this kind of history matters to you, history shaped by limits, delays, and consequences rather than heroics, subscribe to follow the next chapters.